Hi, everybody. Hi around the world. We are truly, this is a global event, and I want to welcome all the people from Chicago, from Toronto, anyone who's listening in Israel, Turkey, wherever it may be. Really appreciate you taking the time. And, we're so happy to be able to have a community event here like this during this time. And, and if everyone could just mute their devices, please. This is an interesting time that we're all going through, but this is a day to commemorate what happened many years ago for Yom HaShoah. And we're delighted to have some people here today to talk about what they've done really to commemorate what happened. And they do it in such a beautiful way through music. And we have Avishai Weinstein from Violins of Hope. And then we also have Vadim Glusman and Angela Yofi from North Shore Chamber Music, the music makers. They're going to talk about what they do. And really, we have some, terrific conversation that's going to be coming for you. And, Hillary said, please put in the chat to JCC if you have questions as we're going through this. Talking, it's a conversation, not just a presentation. But we are so delighted that you're all here. So wanted to turn it over to Avishai to talk about what he's doing, and then we'll switch over to Angela and Vadim.
So thank you very much, Aaron, for the introduction. My name is Avishai Weinstein, and I'm working with my father. We are violin makers in Israel. I currently live in Turkey for the past 10 years with my family. And we've started a project which is called today Violins of Hope. It's already just over 20 years now that we have the project, and I know Vadim and Angela approximately 30 years, I think, give or take. And so I know them basically long before the project started, and they were a part of it basically from almost day one, if not day one. And I still remember Vadim playing some of the instruments that we finished. He was the first one to actually touch a few of them and play and perform on them. So it's a very long friendship, and we know each other for a very long time. Unfortunately, we're a bit far. They're in Chicago and I'm in Turkey, but we do see each other.
And Angela and Vadim, what if you could talk about what you do?
Well, we're musicians. Angela is a pianist. I am a violinist. Under normal circumstances, we travel quite a bit, maybe myself a little more, with touring around the world. We also run a chamber music festival here in Chicago, which really is Angela's baby. If you would like to see one-man show, in this case, it's one-woman show.
It's so nice to hear today.
But of course, now everything is up in the air, so we're in front of the screen connecting to people this way. We also have what's called a Carifomen scholarship fund, where we raise money for talented young musicians, and we've granted over
40 young talented kids.
Yeah,
they received scholarships from the foundation
in the last 5 years, and we have been helping them, especially now, because many families cannot afford music education. So many people have lost jobs lately, so we're trying to do a little bit from that side. But as Avshi said, I remember exactly how long I know Avshi. It's right now it's 29 years and 7 months. I made my aliyah to Israel in September of 1990. In October, I ended up at his father's workshop because I broke my violin and it needed to be fixed. So since October 1990, we've known each other, and yes, as Avshi said, when Amnon, Avshi's father, started collecting instruments from all over the world, those that went through the Shoah, I've seen many of them come into the shop. I've seen many of them being restored, and I've played on quite a few of them when they, so to speak, came out from the surgery.
And when we started dating, that was one of the first places we went together with Vadim. It was a Weinstein shop in Tel Aviv.
Of course, we still go there all the time.
It's a nice date. It's an interesting place to go for that.
If you know the place, you would. It's not that easy to go there. Few people together, so two is almost the limit.
Yes, so social distancing would be
Would be very
problematic.
difficult there.
Yeah. So, Avshi, why don't you tell us a little bit about what is Violins of Hope? How did you find these violins? What do you do with them?
So I'll give you the short story, but Violins of Hope, when it started, it's nothing like what it is today. My father had an apprentice, Daniel Schmidt, who Vadim also knows very, very well, and they are meeting as well together. And when he came to Israel in 1991 from Dresden, which was basically Eastern Germany, just until 2 years before that, he didn't know anything about the Holocaust, about Jewish Holocaust. And he came to Israel and he started meeting survivors, musicians, who were basically the founding members of the Palestine Orchestra, which was later on becoming, of course, the Israeli Philharmonic. And the story of this orchestra is basically the beginning of the instruments that we have today. Many of those musicians were brought to Israel by Bronislaw Huberman, who basically saved their life alongside with their families. He brought about 1,000 people to Israel. And after the war, many of them had German-made instruments. And there was such a strong band in Israel on everything German that they simply came into my grandfather and sold him everything they had. Now, in that point, my grandfather knew that he lost all his family and my grandmother's family, about 400 people. He knew that nobody wants to buy in Israel anything German, but he didn't want to see the instruments basically being destroyed.
Yeah.
So he ended up having a beautiful collection of basically worthless German-made instruments. Although they were very, very good made instruments, nobody wanted to buy them. And in 1991, when Daniel Schmidt came, a few years later, he saw some of those instruments, and he convinced my father to give a lecture in Germany, in Dresden, to the German Violin and Bow Making Association about those instruments and their journey to Israel. And after that lecture, my father spoke on a radio show, and he asked people if they knew about stories of musicians. Of course, we knew a lot that there were many musicians who were saved, and there were few people who actually spoke about it. But he also asked if people had the instruments. And we started getting more and more instruments. We have today about 88 instruments. Some of them we have a very detailed history. Some, unfortunately, we don't.
Now, it's an interesting thing about a musician. You come to Israel with nothing really, but you take your instrument here. Why are instruments so important, and why is music so important?
Vadim.
That's a big question. Well, let's start with this maybe smaller instrument to a musician. The only explanation I can give, it's very similar to its relation of two humans. I know it is maybe difficult to comprehend, but for instance, the violin that I play on today, imagine it was made in 1690. It is well over 300 years old.
Wow.
It has been in hands of many great musicians throughout its history. It has premiered a very number of important pieces along the way. And I've been playing on it for over 20 years now. Just little shorter than we've been married. We've been married for 25 years. I'm playing on that fiddle for 23 or so. And it really is becoming a part of who you are in a way. So instrument is inseparable from the player. And then music, it's I think it's one of those questions that we all know the answer to, because the moment we do not have music, we do suffer. It doesn't matter what kind of music.
Right.
Everyone has his or her own taste. It could be anything from Bach to rap. It really doesn't matter. But music has been a companion to human species basically since get-go, since somebody came across an idea of knocking of two stones or plucking a string on a bow, and that was the first music. I don't think we can survive without it, and I say it not as a musician, I say it as a human being.
Right. And the violin is what we talk about today. Why is violin so important for Jewish culture?
The violin was a very big part. I mean, it's not only that you have all the great Jewish musicians that we all know, but it used to be that, especially in Eastern Europe, almost every Jewish house would have a violin. The klezmers, I mean, they would play for themselves during the weekends, holidays, festivals, whatever. And it was an instrument that they could play on, something they could buy and afford. People couldn't buy expensive instruments. Most of these families were basically living almost from nothing, but
Right.
there were very cheap violins that they could get. And this was a part of Jewish life, of Jewish culture.
It's our music.
On top of it, if you think of instruments of the klezmers, as Akshay mentioned, the two most popular instruments were violin and clarinet. And if we look at the two, they're quite small and as sad as it sounds, but these were the instruments that we could grab and run.
That makes sense.
And it was really a practical consideration as well.
Yeah. And, some of these violins, though, they were played in the concentration camps, right?
Yeah. So some of the instruments, we have instruments either who came to Israel before the war with the members of the Palestine Orchestra, instruments which were in ghettos, instruments which were people were hiding. We even have a violin which was buried by the family and later on recovered after the war. We have many different stories. And the instruments, like Vadim said, it's a violin, something it's easy to carry. Everybody's asking, don't you have cellos? Because there were cellists in the camps. We know them.
Or pianists.
They were pianists, but I've never seen a guy who is about 70, 80 pounds walking with a cello. In those times, a cello case would be with a cello about 50 pounds, if not more. Taking something like that on the Death March, it means one thing, you're not going to make it. It's very simple. But violin, you have a chance. And we know from Elie Wiesel, from his book, from the night that he's talking about his friend Julik, who had the violin with him. And one night he got up and played. And in the morning, unfortunately, they found him dead. But taking a violin was something possible. Taking a violin to the camp sometimes even helped you survive because you were recognized as a musician. The Nazis needed the musicians for the camps, and many musicians survived because of playing. Many of them did not play afterwards. They didn't want to see the instrument anymore, but this was in a way the way of surviving.
Yeah. Yeah, it's part of survival and it's part of passing on that culture. I have a podcast. I interview people, and I interviewed. It's called Inside the Skev, but I interviewed Lori Lipitz from the Klezmer Street Maxwell Band, and she talked about that too a lot, about how it was so important with the culture and in Chicago in particular of bringing that Eastern European Jewry culture and experience to everybody, and it makes you it continues to live on in many ways. So where you guys have played together, where are some of the places that you've played around the world together, and how do you, where's the last places that you've been playing?
Well, I was supposed to be today in Los Angeles, but there is something which puts Vadim at home and me back home as well. So we've been all over the United States, lots of places in Europe, in Israel, of course. We haven't got with the instruments yet to the Far East. Hopefully that's going to happen. I know Vadim has been performed by, I think Vadim, you perform probably every place there is, I guess.
I have never been to Africa.
Oh, okay.
Well,
By
a good place for open air, it's social distancing. It's good now.
Right.
By the time my career started in mid 90s, I think, the only country where they had classical music in Africa was South Africa, and things have changed for better, of course. But one thing that suffered was culture and classical music. So there were no more orchestras to speak of. But other than that, I've played on every continent there is to play.
Wow. And do you ever play with other orchestras that have other cultural significance or backgrounds besides a Jewish background?
Well,
Most of the time, right?
we are considered to be classical musicians, so it would be a mistake to think that we're klezmer musicians. We do play some Jewish music sometimes, but we're purely classical musicians. And back to Violins of Hope, so were those, or most of them, who were, of the musicians that were in the camps and ghettos, most of them were classically trained musicians. Some were from the klezmer, from the villages, and some of the fiddles that are in the collection, they bear a certain
Star of David
ornamentations, like Stars of David, and it's clear that these fiddles come from villages. They were played in the weddings and in bar mitzvahs, in every celebration there was.
Don't forget that one thing. Klezmers had a problem going into the camps. The Nazis needed musicians, but they needed musicians who could read notes, who could sit and play the music they wanted. And the vast majority of the klezmer were basically self-taught. They had no idea how to read and write notes. And from this point, they were, let's say, useless in an orchestra. Some of them were very talented, so they managed to go around it and do play and survive, but the vast majority, unfortunately, could not.
Yeah. Now, Avshi, how many violins do you actually have now in the inventory there?
I think about 88 instruments, which out of them about 60 are traveling.
And are they traveling through to museums or also, in addition to being played?
So Violins of Hope is an exhibition. It's, of course, all the concerts that we do, the educational program, the lectures, outreach. It's everything. So when the collection comes, parts of it can be in a museum or in a gallery as an exhibition. Part will be played. Sometimes we rotate instruments. If we have a very big concert, we might take some of the instruments from the exhibition to the musicians and back. It really, really depends. It's.
When are we going to get to see the instruments here in Chicago?
Well, spring 2023.
Okay.
That's going to be the big project.
Corona will be gone.
Yeah, we'll see with the virus. Probably by then everything's going to be fine. Maybe we have another one, but let's keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah, no kidding. Absolutely. Are you guys all doing things, where you're recording and publishing it out now? I know we had talked about doing some music on this call, but it's hard to do over Zoom. Do you see any types of technology that's coming up where music can be played better live, cross platforms?
Well, we have done a couple of live streams from our home, but it was done not with Zoom. It was done on Facebook, actually.
Okay.
It works fine. It works well, especially under the circumstances where no one has any access to live performances. This is the only way to
Be connected.
to experience it somehow. But I'm yet to see any technology that will really fully substitute an experience of a live performance. I don't think it exists, and I frankly doubt it will ever exist. The experience of human connection, of common energy in a room, cannot be substituted with any machine, as smart as it might be.
Even if you go with all the visual reality stuff, I mean, in the end, music, sports, if you're there, it's one way to experience, and then if you want to see it on TV or listen on a CD or whatever, it's a completely different experience.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Even if you're going to hear and see the person playing live, it's it's better than nothing, of course. Right now, that's what most of us has, probably for the near future, because they're talking about the economy and everything, but I've never heard anyone saying about, yeah, we're going to have concerts in whatever. This I did not hear. But you cannot compare. I don't think you can compare. I agree with Vadim. I mean, this is one of the things that if you're there, and if you're not, it's good, but it's not the same.
Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, with this we will say goodbye for now, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody in person once this madness is behind us.
Right. The rest of us will stay on, but we thank you both for coming on and speaking with us today. So thank you, everybody. I will soft clap.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Be safe.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care, Vadim, Angela.
Bye, Lita.
Bye-bye.
So Avshi, there was some things you want to show us, right?
Yes, so I'll show you some photos of some of the instruments that we have today in the collection. I'll tell you a little bit about their stories and background. The first violin belongs to Erich Wieninger. Abby, can you put it on, please? So Erich, he was a butcher in Austria, in Vienna. He was an amateur violinist, and as you all know, in 1938, the Nazis basically, this is the first one, yes. In 1938, the Nazis basically took over Austria. And one of the first things they did is, like they did everywhere, they made it almost impossible for Jewish people to stay in Austria. Many people ran away. But Erich and his family, unfortunately, didn't have such a luck. His father was arrested, and one of the police officers beat him so hard, he basically killed him. Erich knew who was the police officer who killed his father. He wanted to take revenge, but unfortunately, he himself was immediately arrested. He was sent to 2 concentration camps, to Dachau and Buchenwald. He had his violin with him the whole time. And I think it was his brother, who was married to a Quaker, managed somehow to get him released. The Nazis came to him, said, take your things and go, leave Europe, you have 48 hours and never come back here again. He ran away to the Black Sea. He found the illegal immigrants' boat going to Palestine. It was still possible, the war did not start yet. And as you all know, those boats were always in very bad shape, and the journey that should have taken about 10 days took basically 3 months. It would break down all the time. The boat suffered lots of problems, of course, too many people. And unfortunately, as they arrived to Palestine, to Israel, they were all immediately arrested by the British army, which of course did not allow any Jewish people to come into Israel. Erich was detained in Atlit, in the detention camp in Atlit, and later on He was sent to Mauritius, to a jail in Mauritius. He had his violin the whole time, the photo that you see here with Erich. He had a small band, they called the Bobozen Boys. And they used to go out from the jail to play for the locals. And this is how they managed to earn a little bit of extra food. And he survived. In 1945, when the war ended, the American President Truman forced the British basically to bring back to Israel all the people they expelled during the war. And Erich was one of them. He arrived to Israel. He stayed in Israel until 1988 when he passed away. And his son, after we started the project, he heard about our project and he came to us one day, gave us his father's violin, the one that you see here. He also wrote a book, The Mauritius Shekel. It's in English. I think you can also see it in Amazon. And this violin and I think another 6 others are also in the book of James Grimes called Violins of Hope, Strings of the Holocaust. The other violin that we have is the violin of Shimon Korngold. Now, we all know about many Jewish musicians who played before, during, and of course after the war, but we only know about 3 or 4 Jewish violin makers who worked in Europe before the war. One of them was Yaakov Zimmerman, who made that violin. Abi, can you show it? It's the second photo. It's a very unique violin from a few different ways. It has you'll see very shortly, it has a beautiful Star of David on the back, inlaid by Yaakov Zimmerman, and the label is in Hebrew, and it says, I made this violin for my loyal friend, Mr. Shimon Korngold, Warsaw, 1924, Yaakov Zimmerman. This is the Star of David that you see is in the back of the violin, in the upper side. And the photo that you see of Shimon Korngold, this is him in his house in Warsaw before the war.
And
Shimon,
why did he put the Jewish star on the violin?
sorry?
Why did he put a Jewish star on the violin?
I think this one is a special order of Shimon Korngold. Unfortunately, Shimon died in the war, so we can't really know.
Yeah.
Yaakov Zimmerman was a violin maker. He did some decorated instruments with ornaments of Star of David, but the vast majority of instruments he made were regular classical violins. Shimon Korngold, as I mentioned, he was an industrialist in Warsaw in Poland before the war. And when the war started, he managed to run away. He found a train leaving Poland. In the end, he managed to reach Tashkent, Uzbekistan, where he died, unfortunately, probably from typhus. We don't know. And in 1947, one of his best friends knocked on the door of the Korngold family in Jerusalem and asked them if they knew Shimon. And they said yes. It was their uncle. They didn't hear from him, of course, during the war. They had no idea what happened to him. The guy told them and basically gave them the violin. Now, this is the first instrument that we got to our collection outside the instruments of the Palestine Orchestra. It was the day after my father spoke on the radio show that Nadir Korngold, I think his nephew, he called my father and said, listen, I have this violin of my uncle, and this is the story. And this was the very first violin that we got. Now, Shimon Korngold and Yaakov Zimmerman are also tied to other Jewish musicians. I don't know if any of you know the name Ida Handel. She was one of the most famous musicians, violinists in the world for many years. She used to go to Yaakov Zimmerman in Warsaw to repair her instruments in the 30s. She claims she's about 80, 90 years old now, but she was already a grown-up girl in the 30s. So if you do the mathematics, it's very easy. She told my father that she remembers going to Yaakov Zimmerman. She thought that he was probably around his 60s or 70s in the 30s. And we never heard from him after the war. He most probably died in the ghetto in Warsaw. But Shimon Korngold and him also supported other Jewish musicians. They supported Michel Chevalbet, who told my father that when he was growing up, he was coming from a very poor family, and all his instruments were given to him for free by Yaakov Zimmerman. And his violin lessons were done in this room that you see here in the photo at Shimon Cohen Gold's house, because his parents were too ashamed to bring the violin teacher home. And Michel Chevalbet became the first concertmaster of the Berlin Philharmonic. Of course, during the war, he had to run away from Germany, but he was the favorite concertmaster of Karajan, who was, of course, also a very enthusiastic neo-Nazi. But the best recordings that Karajan ever did with the Berlin Philharmonic were when Michel Chevalbet was the concertmaster.
Wow.
The next violin that we have belonged to Heinrich Haftel. Abby, can you change the photo? This is the label. This is Heinrich Haftel and his violin. When Bronislaw Huberman established the orchestra, he thought, when he saw what was going on in Europe in the 30s, he wanted to try and help Jewish lives and Jewish musicians, and he decided to establish the orchestra in Palestine. With the help of Albert Einstein, he managed to get lots of money from United States to establish the orchestra, and he had good friends in the British government who allowed him to bring the musicians alongside with their families. As I mentioned, he saved about over 1,000 people, which was very remarkable because during this time, they wouldn't allow Jewish people to come to Israel that easy. Now, he brought some of the best musicians from all over Europe. If you see some of the very first programs from the orchestra, you have the name and then the leader of this and that orchestra, the leader of this section here. And he brought lots of great musicians, and he needed someone that he could really, really trust to run this orchestra as a concertmeister. And he chose Heinrich Haftel, who was his student. And Haftel was the concertmeister of the Israeli Philharmonic later on, of course, for many, many years until he retired. And this is the violin that he came to Israel with, which he sold to my grandfather later. The next instrument, I think, is Jacob Hackert. Abby, can you change the photo? Yeah, Jacob Hackert, who was also one of the three Jewish violin makers. This violin that you see here is the first violin he ever made in his life. It was done in Mirecourt in France, in the violin making school there. Hackert had a very good workshop in the Netherlands later, and also a very successful string factory. He sold many instruments, he repaired many instruments, and he had a beautiful catalog of his strings, which he made, and with lots of comments from some of the best musicians of the time. Hackert, unfortunately, he tried to run away. He was caught very close to the border with Switzerland, and then later on sent to Auschwitz, where he was killed on the 20th of May, 1944. His granddaughter and his grandchild, they gave us this violin. There is also a beautiful miniature that he made, a violin which about probably 2.5, maybe 3, not even 3 inches long, a functioning violin with a functioning bow. It's an amazing piece of treasure.
Yeah.
So this, we see here the violin of Hackert, the first violin that he made, and his photo, signed photo, and we have one more photo of his from his workshop.
Well, what was the Hebrew writing in the photo before that picture?
That was the label of the Krongold violin.
Okay.
This one, you mean? It says that I made this violin as a memorial for my loyal friend, Mr. Shimon Krongold, Warsaw, 1924, Tarpad. It's the Hebrew way of writing, 1924, Yaakov Zimmerman.
Okay.
That's the label inside the violin. So we know exactly to whom it was made, by whom it was made, and when. We were, let's say, very, very lucky from this point.
Yeah.
So the next violin, so this is Hackert in his workshop. His string factory was actually later on been used as a medical supply factory, because in those times the strings were made out of gut, usually with some kind of a coating, maybe with the silver lapping or other lapping. And they used to use gut to sew people, humans' wounds. And the factory was later on converted.
Doesn't sound too sterile.
Yeah, well, you know, probably during Corona, people wouldn't really want to be stitched by that, but don't forget this is what they had. And apparently it actually even worked, you know.
Yeah.
So Hackard's violin and Hackard's story is not in the book of James Grimes, but as I said, he's one of, we know about three Jewish violin makers, Hackard, Zimmerman, and there was another person in either Belgium or Netherlands, a good friend of my father, violin maker. He told me, but I've never seen a violin of this guy, and we are not 100% sure if he was or wasn't Jewish. This friend of my father, who was a violin maker in Utrecht in the Netherlands, his father was a cellist, also a violin maker. And during the war, he was hiding a Jewish pianist at home. And one night, one of the Gestapo officers came to his house. He knew that he's a cellist, and he knocked. He said, "Listen, we're going to have some chamber music tonight. Would you like to join us?" And the guy said, "Sure, of course, I'll join you." And he said, "Also bring the pianist you have under your stairs." But she survived, and as you can imagine, he survived as well. So there are also this side of stories.
It's rare.
This is very rare. Usually, I mean, if you were caught hiding Jewish person at homes, I mean, this was end of story, no trial, nothing. I mean, those people alongside with their families were immediately executed. The last violin that we have here, the violin of Feivel Wieninger, it's a very interesting story. Also Feivel and also how we got this instrument. Feivel was born and raised in Romania. And as you all know, Romania decided to join the Nazis during the war. And short after they joined the Nazis, the Romanian government was thinking how they can get rid of their so-called Jewish problem. So their solution was basically to expel tens of thousands of Jewish people to a very remote area called Transnistria. Transnistria was basically marsh area. There was no way that so many people can stay there and stay alive. They sent them there basically to die out of starvation. So Feivel and his family had to go there. It took them about 2.5 weeks. They reached the ghetto in Transnistria, found a place to live. A few days later, Feivel met a judge that he knew from his hometown. And the judge told him, he said, "Listen, I remember that you play violin. I have this very beautiful Amati violin. Amati is the teacher of Stradivari. It's a beautiful, beautiful instrument, very rare, very expensive." And he said, "Why don't you take this violin, play on it, and if you can get something, you can earn something, maybe you can come and share it with me and my sisters." So Feivel was very, very happy for this unique opportunity. He took the violin. He played for the locals in their weddings, sometimes for 2 or 3 days. He had a friend who played the accordion. And the payout would be usually leftover of food, maybe a bit of firewood, some water. And this is how they survived. Until one day, the Romanian police, they heard about this expensive instrument. They came to Feivel and they said, "Feivel, either you're going to give us the violin or we take away your family." Now, he had, of course, to give them the violin. And there's one thing I forgot to mention. A few days after he got the violin, the Amati, after he earned some food, he wanted to give the judge his share. He went to the judge's place, knocked on the door, but nobody opened the door. In the end, he managed to go in, and he saw that he was unfortunately too late. The judge and his sisters couldn't bear the conditions in the ghetto and simply committed suicide.
Oh, no.
And after the violin was actually confiscated from Feivel, one of the locals said, "Listen, my daughter is getting married. She heard you in one of the weddings that you've played, and she wants you to come and play in her wedding." Feivel said, well, I would love to do it, but I don't have a violin, can't play. The guy said, well, that's not a problem. He said, come with me. We go around, we find the violin. So they went around, they found this violin that you see here, which looks really, really, really nice now. And this is the violin that Feivel basically played for the rest of the war. And by being able to bring a little bit of extra food and extra firewood, Feivel and 16 other family members survived.
Wow.
After the war finished, they immigrated to Israel. And many, many years later, Feivel was turning 90 years old, and his little daughter, Helen, who was 1.5 years old when they arrived to the ghetto, she asked his father, she said, Dad, what do you want to get for your 19th birthday? And Feivel said, well, I want to play my violin again. He used to call his violin my friend. So Helen takes this very old violin in this very beaten box, comes to our workshop, puts it on the table and says, my dad is turning 90 years old. He wants to play his violin. What can I do? So we took a look on the violin and said, you know what, let us think about it. We'll get back to you. We called her about a day later, probably, or something like that. Said, listen, it doesn't make sense to repair the violin. You'll end up paying lots of money. It doesn't worth it. Simply get him another violin. It's going to be a better violin. It's going to be a happier person. So Ellen is happy. She goes back to her dad, says, Dad, I have a better solution. I'm going to get you another violin, a better violin. You'll be so happy. And he starts crying. He says, no, you don't understand. I want to play on my violin. I want to play on friend. Now, Helen knew the story of her father and his violin. She wrote a book about it. And she came back to us, to the workshop, told us the whole story. We repaired his violin. And you've never seen a happier child than Feivel the day he got his violin back after the repair. Of course, you're talking about a 90-year-old person. He couldn't really play too much, but he would take the violin out every day, play for a few minutes, but usually simply sit down with it and talk to the violin, tell it stories. And this is how they were together for basically the rest of his life. Unfortunately, after he passed away, Helen gave us the violin. As you can see here, it looks really, really, really nice, but trust me, this is rather a very, very simple instrument because this is what those people could have.
It's amazing that you've gotten so many of these violins with so many great stories. How do people find out about you guys? And, talk a little bit about your background, your grandparents.
Okay, so my background is very, very extreme from both sides. As I said, my father's parents, they both immigrated from Vilna or from around Vilna. My grandfather had 11 sisters and brothers. Only one of his brothers survived. My grandmother had 7 or 8 brothers and sisters. None of her family survived. My late aunt made a research one day. She arrived to about 350, maybe even 400 family members of ours who died during the war. Because my grandparents never ever spoke about it, we simply don't know. We have no idea. We have letters of them begging my grandparents to try and get them out from Europe. My grandparents arrived to Israel in 1938, so they were very lucky. But other than that, we simply don't know. My mother's side is basically the complete opposite. My grandparents were coming from today, from the Novogrodek area. Today it's Belarus. Then it was basically Eastern Poland. They were partisans. Some of you might have heard about the Bielski brothers and the movie Defiance with Daniel Craig and Liv Schreiber and Jamie Bell. So Jamie Bell was playing the role of my grandfather. It's not a documentary. Don't believe everything you see there. But they basically saved more Jewish people than any other Jewish people. It's the biggest Jewish people saving Jewish people during the Holocaust.
It's amazing.
They saved about 1,232 or 34 Jewish people when they were rescued by the Russians in July 1944. They were fighting the whole time the Nazis, together with the Russians, side by side by the Russians, sometimes alone. If you've seen the movie, so some of the scenes, let's say they are right, not exactly like it happened. The one who actually went to fight with the Russians was my grandfather, not Zush. And it was because he killed someone he was not supposed to kill. And instead of getting the death punishment, he was sent to fight with the Russians. He was the head of the fighting unit in the camp. And later on, he decided that he wants to go back to his brothers and their unit, and he defected again, which was again a death punishment, but he managed to get out from that as well. After they were released, my grandfather was unfortunately recruited to the Russian army. He was later on killed, probably in Russia, in Poland or Germany, we don't know. We might have now found his grave. We still have to check it out and say that it's true. My grandmother was already pregnant, and although she was a very enthusiastic communist before the war, after the war, she decided that living in Russia is not exactly the heaven they always told it is. So she took her parents and she ran away to Western Germany by trains. And one of the times she was hiding in a pig train. And my mother started crying when the inspections were going in. So she started kicking all the pigs around her for them to scream so nobody would hear my mother. And they arrived to a displaced people camp in Germany, not far away from Dachau, to Fernwald. There were lots of other people who were rescued by the Bielskis there. And after about 1.5 years, she arrived to Israel.
What an incredible story of survival.
Yeah. And as you probably know, grandparents basically did not exist after the Holocaust. Those who had grandparents were just a very small handful. When my father started first grade in Tel Aviv, when the teacher asked how many of you have grandparents, there were 30 kids in the class, only one child got his hand up.
Oh my God.
And the reason my mother had her grandparents from my mother's side, my grandparents knew each other from before the war. Some of my grandfather's brothers and sisters married my grandmother's brothers and sisters. And my grandmother was in love. My grandfather was in love with my grandmother before the war, but my grandmother was the youngest one among 11 sisters and brothers. So she was very spoiled and she didn't want to marry a village boy. So when the war started, she made a deal with my grandfather. She said that if he's going to save her and her parents, she's going to get married to him.
That's a good deal.
So he did, and she did her part.
It's quite motivating.
So yeah, it worked good for my grandmother, for my grandparents, for my mother. Unfortunately, and of course, my grandfather did not survive, but his uncles, his brothers and sisters did. And I have one of my uncles, Aaron Bielski, who was a child in the camp, and he's also in the movie. He's still alive. He's probably 91 or 92 years old now.
Wow. It's amazing. And you know, your story and what you guys do to continue on that story. How did you said you're in Turkey. How did you end up in Turkey?
Well, I met my wife in Turkey. She's also a violinist. And I moved here. We have our family here. I live here now for 10 years, but I come and go for almost 20 years.
Wow. How is it living in Turkey with what, you know, one of the things that the news has done is everything is basically shifted to coronavirus. And I'm curious, you know, how has the war in Syria and everything with ISIS affected your daily life in Turkey, and even the coup that occurred and everything?
I live in a city of 24 million people. Well, I'll tell you honestly, the last 1.5 months, when we go out, if we need to go here and there with the car, I don't use the brake, only if there is a red light, because there is simply no traffic. So you can imagine what it means in a city of this magnitude not to have traffic.
Yeah.
Of course, there are parts in Istanbul which are full with Syrian refugees. But basically, the war itself is very far away from here. The city runs. I mean, there is no, I mean, people are living here. The huge shopping malls open all the time. Of course, now everything is closed, but I can't say that I felt anything. But I'll ask you a different question.
Sure.
When was the last time that someone came into a synagogue in Turkey and killed certain people?
I don't know. Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean,
I've never felt anything even closely that I can say this is anti-Semitism.
It's very interesting that you point that out, because yeah, living here in America, there is that fear of things that can happen, and what's happened in Pittsburgh and in San Diego, and just throughout, even when we thought there were bomb scares on a daily basis to the JCCs.
Yeah. When I was in Louisville doing a project, I had my personal police officer with me the whole time.
Yeah, no, you're right. And it's sometimes you almost forget, and that you're dealing with that kind of anxiety on a regular basis. And just before this, I want to touch on two things. I interviewed Erez Kaganovitz about the humans of the Holocaust just a couple hours ago, and he pointed something very interesting out. I asked him, when you see a terrorist attack that happens in Israel, and you see things that have happened around the world in shuls and synagogues, do you view it differently? And he said, being in Israel, it's like you don't think about anti-Semitism because everyone's Jewish, but when you're around the rest of the world, you do have that fear. It's different. It is an anti-Semitic type of act in how he views it. And then tomorrow I'm doing an interview of a filmmaker who made this movie called Surviving Skokie. And it's all, I live here in Skokie, Illinois, near Chicago, and it's a huge population of Holocaust survivors here. And the film is really about the survivors, his father, and the neo-Nazis who wanted to march in the late 1970s here in the area. And this is where I've grown up. This is where I live. And there is an incredible amount of hate. So it's interesting that you say that in Turkey, that you feel comfortable and there isn't that type of thought process, because coming from here, I would think the opposite.
Well, I'll tell you, we went to register to get married. I think it was a few days after the incident with the Marmara boat. We never had a problem. When I got my citizenship, of course, I had to go here to do this. It's a process. But I never felt like you're not welcome. I never, ever, ever had this feeling. And all my clients and all the people that I know here, they know exactly who I am. They know my background. They know exactly where I'm coming from. I mean, in the United States, I personally didn't really feel any anti-Semitism. Of course, you see it and you read it, but I've never been into something like that. Although, again, in Fort Wayne, now we had a guy who came and asked a silly question. He said, how can you explain the way that the IDF is doing things in the West Bank after the Holocaust? It's the same thing and blah, blah, blah. And let's say I asked him 3 questions. I said, have you ever seen a Palestinian who has a number tattooed on his hand? Have you ever seen gas chambers in Palestine? Or have you ever seen a soap made out of Palestinian hair? So of course, he've never seen any of them, but he would go on asking the question.
Right.
Is this anti-Semitism? I don't know. I think it's stupidity. But the thing is that it is here, it exists. Probably for someone who's coming from outside, I don't really feel it, and I wouldn't know how to identify it as good as you guys do.
Right.
But yeah, I'm sure it's there. I mean, there is no doubt.
Well, I think what you're doing, and sharing the stories and playing the music and continuing on the tradition of what these people lost is amazing. You know, I want to leave everyone with, you know, where can people find out more about Violins of Hope, and what do you recommend, you know, for people to watch or to learn more?
So there is a website which I made. It's, I'm not proud of it.
Okay.
You can see some of our upcoming events, where we're going to be and what we will do. But you can go online